Hello everyone and welcome. Thanks very much for joining me for another presentation as part of the GreyLearning Webinar Series. Today, talking about my updated Finding Favorites workflow. More on that in just a moment, but first, a quick introduction. I'm Tim Gray, your host today, and I'll be taking you through the various topics related to essentially an organizational workflow and one that I've updated a little bit. I've just returned from an extended trip, and this actually is sort of what got me thinking about this more and more. I'll talk about some of those challenges I faced. This is a photo of me, by the way, in the sand dunes of Namibia in a little town of Kolmanskop, which was fascinating. If you've not had a chance to get there, if you have any way of getting out there, I know it's a long ways away, but a remarkable place to photograph. A ghost town. It used to be essentially a diamond mine, if you will, and a thriving one at that, but when they ran out of diamonds, they moved on elsewhere and left everything behind, and the sand is now taking over the various buildings in the town. But in any event, this was part of an extended trip that I've just returned from that, again, got me thinking a little bit more about some of the workflow issues that I've been struggling with a little bit. I want to first, though, before we get started, put a shout out to Tamron for sponsoring the GreyLearning Webinar Series, making this series of presentations possible. It has been a little while since there's been a presentation because I was traveling for a bit, but we are back and we'll have a number of webinars, including another one in a little over a week or so. We'll have another one. We'll get details about that shortly. And then also, speaking of traveling, I'll be traveling again in the fall, and if you'd like to join me. So today we're talking about finding your favorite photos. If you want to join me to create more favorite photos, take a look at the workshops that are available on my website, timgrayphoto.com/workshops. In particular, this photo is from Austria, a little town in the Alps in Austria that we will visit during this workshop. A great area to explore and photograph. I also have a workshop coming up in Rome, Italy in the fall as well. But enough about that. Let's talk about finding favorites, and specifically a workflow to help you find favorites more easily, and changes to the workflow as I've mentioned. So first and foremost, I want to talk a little bit just about what are my workflow goals. And really this is rather straightforward, I would say, because what I'm trying to do, first and foremost, when it comes to organizing my images, my photos, the first and foremost goal, the most important thing to me is I want to be able to find the photo I'm looking for when I'm looking for it. I'm sure many of you have experienced the frustration of trying to find a particular photo. So, have you been to this location, or do you have any photos of this subject? And you know that you do, but you can't find them. And it can be incredibly aggravating. Maybe you have some clue, you know which camera you used, you probably know what aperture setting you used for the photo you're looking for, but you just can't track it down. And so an organizational workflow is really aimed at trying to make sure that you can find the photos that you're looking for. Another goal, secondarily, I suppose, is I want those photos to essentially remind me of some of the details. I want to be able to recall details of the photo. Once I've found an image, so I find this picture of me, this silly picture of me in a bathtub on a sand dune, and I want to remember where it was. So I might want to, for example, add keywords to some key photos, or make sure that the folder indicates what trip this was, or maybe I've even got GPS coordinates for the photos. We'll talk more about that as we move forward today. But again, using those photos once I find them, not only do I want to have information related to my photos so that I can find them in the first place, but also I want those photos to be able to kind of remind me of some of those details that I might have forgotten over time. For me personally, I always joke about if you want to learn how to do something in the most efficient way possible, that you should find someone to teach you who's lazy. And I always claim to be the laziest guy in the room when it comes to workflow. And what I mean by that is that I want to have a relatively streamlined workflow. I don't want to spend hours and hours and hours trying to organize my photos. I want to try and have a streamlined workflow where I can work relatively quickly, but still have confidence that I'll be able to find my photos later on. For me personally, I also think it's important to the extent possible to make use of standard metadata. I'll provide a key example of that a little bit later today, but trying to make sure that I'm using metadata that will survive beyond the software that I'm using. So I'm using Lightroom Classic CC as the foundation of my workflow. but I don't know if Lightroom will be around forever. Lightroom Classic might be abandoned in favor of Lightroom CC, which doesn't really work for my personal workflow needs, or maybe Adobe will just stop making Lightroom altogether. And so when there's changes in the software world, I want to make sure that I've got some ability to retain the information about my photos, that I don't have to worry too much about which software is, coming and going at any given time. And I would also love to avoid some frustration. So I mentioned that frustration of not being able to locate a particular photo at a given time or not being able to recall details about a photo. I just want my workflow to work for me. And then finally, I just want to feel confident overall. I want to feel confident that I'm managing my workflow well, that I've got a workflow that's working for me, that I can find my photos, all of these details. I just want to know that it's working right. And that gets up to a couple of challenges that I face. Some of these are just recurring challenges that I run into constantly. When I'm traveling, I tend to be pretty busy. And so, for example, one of the key challenges in my own workflow is time. There's just not enough of it. And so when I'm out traveling, when I'm leading a photo workshop or just traveling for the sake of travel, very often photography is happening from sunrise to sunset and all day long in between. And I don't know about you, but I have a tendency to capture lots and lots of photos. When I see a scene that I really like, I've got to capture it in all sorts of different ways and different angles. And I just like taking a lot of photos. And so at the end of the day, I've got a lot of photos that I might need to review. And on account of that photography from sunrise to sunset, and my travels might be somewhat extended, and I'm not as young as I used to be, I'm tired. At the end of the day, I, more often than not, am tired to the point that maybe I can stay awake, but I don't feel that I really have the energy to sit down at the computer and go through all of my photos, which might be hundreds or even thousands of photos from a given day. And then another challenge, at least for me, now I tend to travel pretty extensively, and so location tends to be somewhat key to my photography. In other words, my photography often happens while I'm traveling somewhere, oftentimes far from home. So there's some logistical challenges. Challenges related to changing locations and an extended trip where lots going on. So here, for example, this is the map out of Lightroom for a portion of a trip last year in Austria, and you can see spread out across the map a variety of different locations. This was over the course of multiple days. And then later in the trip, we transitioned to Italy and several locations in Italy. You can see down toward Naples and Capri, the island of Sardinia, and then Rome and the surrounding area. And so a lot of different locations even within that country. So switching from one country to the next, different locations, different time frames, different levels of exhaustion, essentially, depending on what the schedule was looking like at any given time. And so here, looking at that overview map, a wide variety of locations, a relatively extended period of time, and lots of photos. And one of the key things that I've been thinking about recently, especially as some of my travels have involved relatively long trips, is that I realize that my workflow for reviewing my images has been a little bit incomplete. And so, for example, I'll find within my catalog in Lightroom while I'm traveling, at the beginning of the trip, maybe I have some photos that I already reviewed and assigned some star ratings to. And most recently during the trip, the last day or two, maybe I had assigned some star ratings to photos. But then I realized that in between, there might have been a couple of days where I wasn't reviewing those photos. I was not assigning star ratings at all. And so I've got these gaps where some of the photos, in some cases, chunks of photos from multiple days, might not have any star ratings. They might not have been reviewed at all. So I reviewed images at the beginning of my trip and toward the end of my trip, but I missed some days in between. And depending on the length of the trip, there might be a day where I did review the photos, then a day where I didn't, then a day where I did, then a day where I didn't. And it just starts to become sort of this jumbled mess where I can't keep track of which photos I've already reviewed and which I haven't. And I don't want to spend time re-reviewing the same photos over and over just because I can't remember which ones were which. And I've been trying to think recently about the best way to approach this. Obviously, there's a variety of things that I could do, but I also wanted to take into account those workflow goals that I had and trying to be sure that I'm aligning with those, that I'm not kind of breaking some of my own rules just to try to fix another problem in my workflow. And so what I decided was that I needed to have a way to mark photos as having been reviewed. Now, in theory, as I'll talk about a little bit later, I have a star rating approach where I assign stars, and no stars means, in theory, the image was reviewed, but it was not a keeper. In theory, I could delete it, or it's an outtake, or it's just not one of my favorites. But the problem is that a 0-star rating could mean that the image was never even looked at, or that it was looked at and I just decided not to give it a star. And so I wanted to come up with a solution that I felt would work, that would meet all of my criteria for my workflow, that wouldn't introduce more confusion. And I decided upon having a label essentially that would identify photos that need to be reviewed, so that I could make sure that every photo would get reviewed eventually, or at least that I would know which photos had been reviewed and which photos had not been reviewed. And that's what I want to share with you today. Not just this one change, this key change to my workflow, but what the overall workflow looks like as a consequence of that. So let's take a look at what that workflow now looks like. We'll go ahead and switch to Lightroom here, and we can take a look at a typical workflow. Now, I should hasten to point out that in this case, I'm using a Lightroom catalog that is very minimal. I'm essentially starting with an empty catalog, and I wanted to do that just to kind of simplify, to take away all the clutter and confusion so that you could get a better sense of what this workflow looks like without a bunch of distractions. So first and foremost, you might have noticed from the slide that I showed that the images that I had presumably not yet reviewed, they all had a red color label. And so part of the issue here is that I want to be using metadata fields that are somewhat standardized. Many photographers are using pick versus reject flags, for example, in Lightroom to identify favorites versus outtakes. The problem with the pick and reject flags, though, is that they're not part of an actual metadata standard. And so that metadata, even if you save your metadata out to the photos themselves, it can't be read by other software, including Adobe Bridge. So you can add a pick flag in Adobe Lightroom Classic, but you can't see that pick flag in Adobe Bridge. And so that creates a little bit of a challenge. It's part of the reason I didn't really want to use pick flags as part of this workflow. Star ratings are, however, included in metadata, a standard part of metadata, so that we can preserve that information even if we had to switch software. And we also have color labels. Color labels are a little bit odd in the sense that they're not necessarily entirely standardized. So the color label field is included in the XMP metadata standard, and many software applications support that XMP standard. So if we assign a color label, then we can have reasonable confidence that that information will be preserved in the long term. But there's a wrinkle, and I mentioned Lightroom versus Bridge. Well, this wrinkle when it comes to color labels actually affects these two applications. So let's take a look at those color labels. If I go up to the menu in Lightroom here and then choose Metadata, followed by Color Label Set, you'll see that we have options for the Bridge default color labels or the Lightroom default color labels. Oddly enough, these are both applications created by Adobe, but they both use different definitions of color labels, because the color label field isn't really a color label per se. It's just a label, which actually means it's essentially just a word in metadata. And so in order to give it any sort of meaning, we have to use specific words. So I'm going to choose Edit here so we can see what those specific words are. And logically enough, when we're using Lightroom, the Lightroom defaults for a red color label, the word that gets put into the label field is red. And for yellow, it's yellow, and green, it's green, etc., etc. Very simple, very straightforward. It makes perfect sense. Why would you do anything other than this? Well, I don't know. I don't have the answer for that, but I can tell you that when they created Adobe Bridge, they chose to use different words. So it's select versus second, approved, review, and to do. And so if you assigned color labels in Adobe Bridge before using Lightroom, these are the words that get put into the label field. Lightroom doesn't understand those, and so it doesn't show you the right colors. You could switch to the Bridge default, or you could change the values. There's a variety of issues there. But in any event, the key is to keep in mind that those color labels are not necessarily universally supported in terms of the words they use, but most software does support at least accessing that label field in XMP metadata. So for our purposes, I want to use the Lightroom default values. If you've never used Adobe Bridge, this is probably a good reason to stick with Lightroom and not go back and forth for sure. But again, making sure that you have the right definitions here for those color labels. And if you had been using Adobe Bridge for a long time and you're just getting started with Lightroom, then you might want to use the Bridge values, even though I would argue they're not the most logical values for color labels. At least it'll give you that consistency in your workflow. All right, so we've defined those color labels, and the reason that I want to make sure those are established to my liking is that that's going to be one of the cornerstones of this updated workflow. And part of this involves assigning metadata to photos right at the time of import. So I'm just going to cancel to close that dialog here because I don't actually need to change the color label definitions. They were already set perfectly fine. And then I'm going to go back to the metadata menu, and you'll see that we have an option for Edit Metadata Presets. So I'm going to choose that option from the menu, and you'll see that I have a dialog here where I can specify information that I want to include as part of a metadata preset. And spoiler alert, I can assign a metadata preset during import so that all of the information I add here will be added automatically to every single image that I import. And so, for example, if we scroll down, you'll see there's a variety of different bits of information. So I could add copyright information and contact details, etc. So I could put my creator information here, for example. I could put my address and phone number and my email address. Notice that as I add information to any of these fields, the check mark automatically gets turned on over on the right-hand side. And that indicates that those fields will be included as part of this metadata preset. Now, when you're creating such a preset, you'll want to be thoughtful. You'll want to make sure that you're comfortable having all of this information added to every single photo. And so, for example, information about the image or the job. So here's a job identifier, for example. Well, if you use a job identifier in metadata to identify a job for a client, you certainly don't want to put the exact same job identifier on every single photo upon import. Those would be unique on a per job basis. So you'll want to be relatively generic. You want to use these metadata presets just for information that would apply to essentially every single photo. So again, copyright information, contact information. I'll just put my name here and I'll say the copyright status is copyrighted. I can put a URL to my website that has my terms and conditions, etc. I won't worry about filling in all of these details. You get the idea that I can add as much of this information as I'd like. But in terms of my workflow, there are some key considerations up here at the top. I could, for example, assign a star rating. If I wanted to use a 1-star rating as kind of a base level, I need to review this photo, I could assign a 1-star rating right here as part of my metadata preset. In this case, what I want is a color label. I'm going to use a red color label to identify a photo that has not yet been reviewed. And how do I know it's not been reviewed? Well, if I haven't imported the photo yet, I haven't really reviewed the photo yet. So I'm going to apply this metadata preset during the import process into Lightroom so that every photo I add to my catalog gets a red color label. And now I know any photo with a red color label represents a photo that I need to review, that I've not yet reviewed. Now, of course, this assumes that you haven't already been using color labels for some other purpose. You could certainly use a different color label. For example, the purple color label tends not to be used all that often, I find, by photographers. So you could use that. And that's part of the reason that we needed to know what are those color label definitions that we took a look at. And so in this case, I know that the word red represents the color label, the value in Lightroom for a red label. So I can just enter that word right here into my preset. And again, I could continue going through all these different fields and adding additional details if I feel that any of this information is something that I want to add to every photo upon import. So now that I have defined, let's assume all of the bits of information, all of the metadata fields have been filled out that I actually want to include as part of this preset, up at the top, the preset pop-up, I can click and then choose to save the current settings as a new preset. So I'll go ahead and choose that option, and I'll just call this Tim Gray Import. and that indicates to me this is my personal preset, and it is the preset that I want to assign during import, which is key in this case because that's assigning that red color label, for example. So I'll go ahead and click Create in order to save that preset. You'll notice that the preset now is indicated up at the top of the Edit Metadata Presets dialog, and I'm all done. So now I'm ready to import photos into my Lightroom catalog and apply this metadata preset as part of that process so that all those photos will get my copyright info, get my contact information, etc., but will also get a red color label. So I'll go ahead and click Done in order to apply that change, well, those changes, so that now I have my own workflow preset essentially for metadata, which I'll apply during import. Just as a little bit of an aside, because I want to talk about the overall import process here in just a moment, I could also create a develop preset. In other words, a preset that alters the overall appearance of photos, applying the exact same adjustments potentially to every single photo that I import. That might sound like a little bit of a silly thing. In fact, it's been the subject of a couple of Ask Tim Gray email newsletter questions recently. But actually, I do find that this approach makes sense, if for no other reason than a develop preset essentially represents, in large part, just different settings than the defaults. And so anything that you have a tendency to change in terms of those overall settings, if you tend to apply that change for every image, you might want to use a develop preset, and you might want to apply that during the time of import. For example, some photographers, their style might be that they only capture black and white. Maybe they're a wedding photographer, but everything they do is black and white. Well, they could create a develop preset that has kind of a basic black and white interpretation of the photo, whatever suits them stylistically, and then apply that during import so that every image will now have a preview in black and white. So you don't have to go through that extra step. And more importantly, it's not that necessarily a generic preset for the develop module is going to be the right set of adjustments for every photo, probably not even remotely. But it gives you a better starting point, or if nothing else, it gives you a preview that's sort of more accurate in terms of the potential for a photo. So black and white, for example, versus color. But I also find there are other adjustments that I tend to apply for virtually every image. So let's take a look at that. I'll go ahead and just switch to the develop module with a sample image selected here. And I actually, in this case, have already applied the auto adjustment. So clicking the auto button in order to apply an adjustment to the image based on image analysis. So at the top of the tone adjustments, exposure, contrast, etc., at the top right, you'll see that we have an auto button that you can click in order to apply an automatic adjustment. I know for many photographers that sounds absurd. Why would you want to let Lightroom try to evaluate your image and apply adjustments automatically instead of you adjusting the way you think the image should be interpreted? And quite simply, I find that the auto adjustment often provides a better preview than the default out-of-the-camera preview that I would otherwise get in Lightroom. I'm not suggesting that this is necessarily anywhere close to final for the image, and I probably would go through and tweak just about every one of those sliders. But as I'm reviewing my photos, trying to choose my favorites versus not so favorites, I do find that I get a better preview for the image, and therefore a better experience in terms of reviewing my photos if I do enable that automatic adjustment. Going down a little bit further here, lens corrections is another key adjustment that I tend to apply to just about every image. And so in the lens correction section, I can turn on remove chromatic aberration. That generally is good or nothing. In other words, it's not going to harm the image. If anything, it will improve the image. And then profile-based corrections based on the specific lens that was used to capture an image. So I can turn on this checkbox and put my setup, the pop-up here, to auto, and now the correct profile will be applied automatically for every image that I apply my preset to. And if there's no preset, if there's no profile for the lens in question, then no profile will be applied. So there's not going to be any harm here, other than, of course, the adjustments applied based on a compensation for the behavior of the lens, which I find generally is a good thing. And if it's not, I could always turn it off later. And then I actually, under detail, for color noise reduction, I have a tendency to increase the value for smoothness. I find that a relatively high value for smoothness gives me a much improved appearance in terms of color noise within the photo. I don't have to get too aggressive with the color noise reduction. I can instead blend the color into the surrounding image so that it looks better. It improves the overall result. So those are just a few examples of the types of things that I tend to apply as part of a preset for all of my photos during import. The point being is that I can pick and choose which sorts of adjustments. So here I've applied some adjustments to a sample image, and then within the Develop module, over on the left panel, to the right of the presets header, you'll find the plus button. I can click the plus button and then choose to create a preset. So I'll go ahead and create a preset. I'll just call this Import Preset. I'll leave it in the User Presets group. And I'm going to actually start off by checking none. So at the bottom left, I'll turn off all of the checkboxes, essentially, except for process version, which you need to have left on. I will enable the auto settings. So that is the equivalent of clicking that auto button at the top right, essentially, of the basic set of adjustments. And then I can pick and choose. So, for example, in this case, my color noise reduction and my profile-based lens corrections, as well as chromatic aberration, and anything else that I decided that I wanted to apply to the image. Maybe you have a tendency to, boost the clarity somewhat, and you want to include that as part of a preset. Whatever it is that you tend to apply, you can include as part of a preset that you would then apply during import. So I'll go ahead and click the Create button, and now I have that preset created that I'm able to use during that import process so that all of the photos will get the benefit of the adjustments that I included as part of that preset. So at this point, we're ready, after having configured all of these factors related to my workflow, I'm ready to actually start importing photos. So all of the work that I just talked about, I would have done long before I go out on a trip. I would just make sure that those are essentially the default settings, that is my configuration for Lightroom. And then as I get started on a trip, I can start to import photos into my Lightroom catalog. So in the Library module, over on the left panel, I can go down to the bottom of that left panel and click on the Import button in order to bring up the Import dialog. And in this case, I'm actually using a set of test images just for our demonstration purposes here today. And so I'll go ahead and set the source here. I've got a folder on my desktop for the first batch of photos that I'm going to import. And then up at the top center, I want to copy these photos to the designated location. And here I'll just use the Pictures folder as the target. Actually, I do have a folder on my desktop that I'm using for that purpose. So I'll go to the desktop here and select the particular folder. This essentially is mimicking an external hard drive, because normally I would be using an external hard drive to download all of my photos, to copy all of the photos from my media cards out of the camera. So right now there's a folder on the desktop that is mimicking, that is pretending to be a media card that I might have taken out of my camera and inserted into a card reader. And then I'm using the Photos folder on my desktop also, and that is pretending to be an external hard drive. So if you'll use your imagination for me, we're importing from a media card to an external hard drive, and then I'll build the standard previews. I don't need to build smart previews. I want to make sure that I'm not importing suspected duplicates. I'll make a second copy of these photos to a folder, in this case, a backup folder on the desktop. So again, all of this just a simulation at this point, because I'm copying photos from a folder on the desktop to a folder on the desktop and making a backup copy to a folder on the desktop. So obviously I would want those backups in different locations, etc. I'm not going to add any of these photos to a collection. I won't worry about renaming. But then we get down to Apply during import. The Develop settings that we talked about, so I can click the pop-up here, go to User Presets, and find my Import preset so that I'm applying those auto adjustments as well as the profile-based lens corrections to all of these images being imported. And then I have, of course, that metadata. So there's my Tim Gray import metadata preset that I created a little bit earlier. I can select that so that my copyright information, my contact information, and that red color label all will be added to the metadata for all of these images all at the same time. I would also typically add some keywords. So in this case, let's just scroll through. These photos were all essentially in Austria, and so I could add some keywords that apply to all of the photos. I'll just add Austria and Europe, for example, as keywords here. and then down below into a subfolder. So I'm copying the photos right now, if we take a look back at the top right corner, to a folder on my desktop pretending to be an external hard drive, but I also then want to put all of these individual photos into a subfolder. And this is actually another key part of my overall organizational workflow. I'm using the folder structure on the hard drive as what I think of as my first line of defense, my first level of organization. And the way I've talked about that folder structure in the past is that the folders should reflect how you think about your photos. So if I come to you and say, hey, do you have any pictures of whales? You might say, oh yes, during my trip to Alaska, I had some pictures of whales. Or crop dusters, and yes, I photographed crop dusters in the Palouse. Or, you might think about client names or products that you photographed. Depending on the type of photography you're typically doing, how you think about your photos might differ. And I suggest using a folder structure that matches that, because your folders are typically going to be the first place you go when you're looking for a particular photo. For some photographers, that might even mean a date-based folder structure. That is not the case for me. Most of the time, I don't know what day of the week it is, and so I certainly don't remember what date I captured any of my key photos. But if that works for you, that's wonderful as well. The key is that I'm going to turn on this Into Subfolder checkbox down here in the Destination section of the right panel in the Import dialog, and then I'll specify a name. So these photos are from Austria, and this was a trip in 2018, and so I might just label that accordingly. Yes, I know I mentioned that I don't really keep track of my photos based on the date, but in situations where I visit the same location multiple times, I want to make sure that I can specify this trip versus that trip. So Austria in 2017 versus Austria in 2018, for example. And then down below, I'm organizing into one folder. In other words, I want all of my photos to go into this folder that I have specified. I don't want to create, for example, date-based subfolders where I'd have folders for the day and the month and the year for all of my photos. To me, that starts to get a little bit too complicated and messy. So presumably at this point, I have defined all of my sort of core settings for my import. One thing that you might do is to save a preset. So I've talked about a couple of presets, a develop module preset for saving and applying adjustments, changes in appearance for photos. And I talked about a metadata preset where I can have my contact information and copyright information, etc., applied automatically to multiple images. Well, I've also configured the import dialog here, in this case, specific to this particular import. But that probably provides me with a good jumping off point for future imports. Or I could, for example, clear out the keywords and I could make this a little bit more generic and then save a preset. But I find many photographers don't even realize that this import preset option even exists. And it does. Down at the bottom center of the import dialog, you'll see the label import preset, and right now I have none as the import preset that I'm using. I can click that pop-up and you'll see that there's an option to save the current settings as a new preset. So I'll go ahead and choose that option, and I'll just give this a name, Tim Gray Import. These are just my general settings for importing, and I'll click create, and then I could use that in the future essentially just to reset. So if I've made some changes, I can always kind of go back to my initial starting point for the settings for import. So at this point, let's assume that we've got everything squared away. I hope I have everything squared away and configured exactly as I'd like it. So now at the bottom right corner of the import dialog, I can click the import button, and the photos in question will be imported. And so there's actually quite a lot going on right now. I'm copying photos to theoretically my external hard drive and making a backup copy to another hard drive. And I've added some keywords and some metadata. I'm applying adjustments automatically. We'll see the previews update for that momentarily as well. And you might already notice in the background that I have red color labels assigned to each of these images. And again, that was one of the key changes that I made to my workflow, and that is to have a red color label assigned to all of the images on import, so I know these photos have not yet been reviewed. You'll notice, by the way, that I get a dialog. This is As I mentioned, a brand new catalog that I'm just using for today's presentation, and so some of the settings have not yet been established. In this case, Lightroom has not yet asked me about enabling address lookup, and so it's asking, because it detected that there are GPS coordinates embedded in metadata for these images, or at least some of these images, it's offering that it can essentially use Google Maps to figure out where, based on those GPS coordinates, that location happens to have been. And then it can give me an indication. So here, for example, some photos captured in Austria, and it can tell me the approximate city, for example, the specific location. So not only GPS coordinates, but also some words. It's not adding them to metadata, it's just showing me that information. And I do find that that can be helpful, and so I generally prefer to enable that option so that address lookup will happen automatically. You can see it here on the pop-up associated with the identity plate. So now the images are being updated in terms of those previews. And I'll be the first to admit that the auto adjustment settings don't work well for every image. So here, for example, this image of a sliver of a moon, you can see that it was brightened up way too much. So that set of auto adjustments actually didn't work out very well. One note, the auto during import is actually a little bit different from the auto later. And that's because during import, it's not evaluating the original raw capture. It's actually using essentially a JPEG preview. And so even though I applied auto during import, I'm going to hide the histogram so we can see more of these adjustments. Even though I have those auto adjustments applied, the auto adjustment button is still available. And if I click it, I will more than likely, as we see here, get a different interpretation of the photo. I consider that to be a little bit of a bug. I hope that Adobe will find a way to work around that at some point so that we get a more consistent behavior with auto. And in this case, I probably would even back off. So again, those adjustments are not necessarily optimized for every photo, but I do find in general that the auto set of adjustments gives me a better starting point for most of my photos. So I have that information, the adjustments that have been applied. I do have the metadata. So for example, if we take a look in the library module, if we go into the metadata section, I can actually see that I had applied the Tim Gray import preset. So right here, the preset listed underneath the metadata heading, and I could scroll through. I'll just switch this to EXIF and IPTC, for example, and I can scroll through. I can see the red color label and my contact and copyright information, etc. So those details that I added in terms of the metadata will appear, of course, because I imported. I applied all of those different updates during the import process. And so let's go ahead and simulate a review of these photos. And so typically when I'm reviewing photos, it might have been over the course of, several days, couple weeks, whatever the case might be. I might go through and review some, but not all of the photos. So for example, maybe I wanted to jump to some of these sunrise at an alpine lake shots. And so I'm going to go and essentially I'm just segmenting the images. I might filter. So if I press the / key on the keyboard, I can get the library filter, and I could go through and sort by various attributes. For example, under metadata, maybe I would choose the dates. So I could select a range of dates. So in this case, we have a couple of dates in September. Point is that I could work with these images in little segments. So maybe I would start here, for example, with this photo, and I would go through and now try to identify my favorites. And as many of you are probably already aware, this is when I would tend to use star ratings in what I consider a little bit of a unique way. Normally, kind of the default assumption for star rating would be that, for example, 1 star is a bad image and 5 stars is a great image. But to me, I don't feel like there's tremendous value in assigning a 1-star rating, meaning I don't like this photo. And so instead I use a star ratings as one being, this is, I think, a keeper. I like this photo. And I'll also review the images in several passes. And part of the aim there is just to kind of separate out the emotional response. If I had a great morning at this lake and I think the images are just amazing, I might give them all a 5-star rating because I'm just still having this kind of emotional high from the experience. Then later come back and say, oh, some of these are not very good. One of them's not even in focus and I gave it a 5-star rating. And so the approach I use is to go through and give a 1-star rating as the only option the first time I review the photos. And so any image that I think might be a keeper, I would just press the number 1 on the keyboard to assign a 1-star rating. That one looks interesting as well. And let's go through, and oh, that one looks like an interesting shot as well. So I can just kind of pick and choose which photos I think might have the most potential. In fact, I think this one, if I cropped it, might be kind of interesting. So I'll give that a 1-star rating as well. And this one, I don't care for the clutter of some of the buildings there, but I think it still has some potential. So I'll give that one a star as well. So the idea is that the 1-star rating is just kind of a yes or no. Do I think this one has potential, or is it an outtake? If I think the image has potential, my feeling is when in doubt, give it a star, because I can always remove the star later. And then if I feel it's an outtake, almost I feel like I could delete the image if I was the type of photographer who tended to delete images quickly, then I would give it no stars. So the idea is that now I've reviewed this little set of photos, marking those which I consider to be my favorites. Let's assume that these are the only photos that I have the energy or the enthusiasm to actually review right now. Well, I could just mark those photos as having been reviewed. So remember, that red color label is identifying these images as those that I have not yet reviewed. Well, these have been reviewed, so I'm going to click on the first image on the film strip down at the bottom panel, and then I'll hold the Shift key on the keyboard and click on the last image so that I'm selecting that entire range of photos. But very, very important, keep in mind, when I'm working in the loop view, in other words, when I'm looking at a single image, even though I have multiple images selected on the film strip, as far as Lightroom is concerned, I'm only working with one photo. That means if I remove a color label right now, then it will only remove the color label from this one image that we're seeing in the loop view preview. And so in order to change attributes for multiple photos at the same time, I want to switch to the grid view. So I'll press the letter G on the keyboard to switch to the grid view. So you can see that I have these photos selected. And now that I have multiple photos selected and I'm in the grid view, I can change the attributes for all of these photos all at once. In this case, I just want to remove the red color label. So I'll press the number 6 on the keyboard, and you can see that the red color label is removed for those photos. So I now have some of the images that have a star rating but no color label, and that means I did review the image, there's no red color label, and I liked it, it's got a star. And then here's another image that has no red color label, that means I looked at it, I reviewed it, but it also has no stars, which means I wasn't so crazy about it. Maybe it's an outtake, maybe at some point I could delete it, etc. So then, of course, as I'm continuing to work, so here I've kind of reviewed a few images in the middle of that batch. There's images at the beginning I still need to review and images at the end. But let's assume it's a new day and I need to import additional photos. And so I could click the import button, and under import preset, I might want to make sure right from the start it will default to none. So for my import preset, I might want to select that Tim Gray import right away. Then I can select my source, so in this case that batch 2 folder, and then I'll go check my various settings. So I'm still copying to my photos, in this case folder, but that again would be an external hard drive typically, not importing suspected duplicates, making a second backup copy, not renaming. In this case, let's see if these keywords still apply. Yes, in this case, the keywords still apply. These are still photos from Austria in Europe, so I could keep those keywords as opposed to deleting them at this point. And in this case, I do want to import to the exact same folder down underneath the destination. But naturally, some of this I might want to change since this was potentially a different import from a different trip. And that's again why I mentioned at the beginning, you might want to create that import preset with just some very basic settings. So without yet having established a folder here for into subfolder and without having added any keywords. So just keep that in mind when you're creating your import preset in the first place. Or potentially, if you have different photographers, you might have different settings all going into the same Lightroom catalog, and so you might have different presets for different cameras, different photographers, whatever the case might be. So I'll make sure I've got that import preset and then the Tim Gray import for metadata. So I've got everything established the way I want it. I'll go ahead and click import to import that additional batch of photos. which in some respects gives me an additional challenge because now I have yet more photos. So I already didn't review all of the images from the previous import. Now I have additional images that I need to review as well. But perhaps most importantly is that I have that information as part of my catalog. So I know which photos I have imported and reviewed, and I know which photos I've imported but not yet reviewed. And so to me, that's a really big part of that overall process. Now, keep in mind, by the way, if I wanted to further review some of the details of the photo, I mentioned GPS information. I happen to, most of the time, be using a camera that has a built-in GPS receiver. And so you'll see at the bottom right of the thumbnails, you might see that little pushpin icon. That is an indication that there are GPS coordinates in metadata. You can see over here on the right panel the GPS field in metadata, which shows what the coordinates were for this image. I don't imagine that any of you happen to know exactly where that is on the map just based on the GPS coordinates, but we can get that information in the map module. And in fact, that pushpin at the bottom right of the thumbnail for photos that include GPS metadata, I can click on that pushpin to automatically go to the map module for the image in question. So it will load up the map here in just a moment, showing me the image highlighted, the location highlighted essentially. So I can see that this is the Hallstatter See. This is a lake in the Alps at the town of Hallstatt. And so, for example, not only do I have this information that I can reference, notice that I also have over on the right side, this is that metadata that's not actually added to metadata. It's just sort of clues, if you will. So based on the GPS coordinates, based on having enabled that GPS lookup, I see that this is Hallstatt. It's in Oberösterreich or Upper Austria in the country of Austria with an ISO country code of AT. And so that gives me additional information about my photos, but I might also want some additional details, and that's where keywording comes in as well. And I know I've talked about keywording in the past. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with my overall approach here. The idea is that keywords are twofold. Number one, they help me find images, but also they help me remember details about the photo. So here's a picture of a boat. I might not know what this object is on the water in the foreground of this image, so I might want to be reminded. Or with this photo, for example, maybe I can't remember what they call this sport. Or maybe I'm searching for a photo of a paraglider. In any event, if I add that as a keyword. So I don't tend to use a lot of keywords because for the most part I'm using folder structure and star ratings to locate specific images. And then I'm using now this red color label to identify photos that I've not yet reviewed. But especially for key subjects, for things I think I'm going to want to search for or want to know about later, then I would tend, and especially for my favorite photos, I would tend to add keywords. So in the keywording section here, I could just type paraglider, for example, to add that as a keyword. But again, a big part of this is knowing which photos have versus have not been reviewed, and therefore which photos I still need to review. And so that's where filters really come into handy. And so, for example, down at the bottom on the film strip, the bottom panel up at the top right of the film strip, I've got the little filter switch, this light switch button that I can flick or turn on in order to enable the filters and then choose which filters I want to enable. So here, for example, I want to see images that have a red color label assigned to them. So here are all of the images, in this case from the current import or the previous import as the case may be, but I can also go to my Austria folder with that filter still enabled. Now I can see all of the images from this entire trip that I have not yet reviewed. And so maybe I would start at the beginning. As I mentioned before, maybe I would filter just a couple days at a time or one day at a time worth of photos. Whatever it is that makes the most sense for me, I can then go through, review images, and I typically would break these up into small batches so that it's a little bit more manageable, and then identify those favorite photos. So this one I happen to like, for example, so I'll press 1 to give it a 1-star rating, and then go through and take a look at some of these sunrise photos, and maybe that one there I'll give a 1-star rating to. So I'm just using the arrow keys on the keyboard to navigate among the various photos, left and right as needed, and then pressing a 1 on the keyboard for a 1-star rating, or just moving on to the next image if I don't feel that it is worthy of a star rating. And then when I kind of get to the end of a sequence or of a manageable batch, or maybe all of the images if I've applied a filter, then once again I can select all of those images on the film strip. Don't forget to switch to the grid view, and then with multiple images selected and in the grid view, I can change the attribute. So again, in this case, I'm using a red color label to identify photos that I need to review. The keyboard shortcut for that happens to be the number 6 on the keyboard, so I can just press the number 6 in order to remove that red color label from those selected photos. And notice, because I have a filter applied so that I'm only viewing images with the red color label, all of those other images have magically disappeared, so that at any given time I'm only browsing the photos that I actually need to review, those with a red color label. And then of course, a big part of this, the whole point essentially, was to make sure that I can hopefully track down the specific photos that I'm looking for. And so there actually are only a couple of key things that I need to consider when it comes to locating photos generally. And those tend to be the folder and the star rating. So I mentioned the star ratings, and if I actually go back and filter based on a 1-star rating rather than the red color label, I can see the images that I've assigned a 1-star rating to. And typically, later in my workflow, after I've identified my keepers, presumably, for example, in this case, I've reviewed all of my images from this trip, and so I've got a bunch of images with a 1-star rating. And then a little bit later, ideally, if my schedule, if my particular needs, if I need to submit images for a project, then I might need to hurry up this review. But whenever possible, I try to make sure that I let at least a few days pass between giving that 1-star rating and deciding whether or not an image deserves an upgrade. And then I'll go through and assign a 2-star rating to any images that I feel are among my best from a given trip, for example. So I like this sunrise shot, and I think, maybe one of these others, I might give a 2-star rating to this one, for example. Whatever the case might be. Again, going through and identifying favorites. So 1 star means I think this one has potential. 2 stars means generally this is, I think, one of my better shots from this trip. And then over time, after I've had a chance to work in the develop module and optimize the photos, maybe share them online and see what sort of response I get, then a 3-star rating typically is going to be one of my very best photos, at least recently. And then 4 and 5, those start to become like my portfolio. These are my best pictures of all time. But in large part, then, my process for locating specific folders is really twofold. Number one, I go to the specific folder. So I'm looking for photos from Austria. I go to one of my Austria folders. So hopefully, just based on your folder structure, you can get to the folder that contains the images that you're looking for. And then once I've navigated to that location, I can simply enable a filter for star rating. So if I just want to see all of my selects from a trip, that would be a 1-star or greater rating. If I want to see my very best images from a trip, that would be a 2-star or better rating. I could also, of course, look at all of my photos in my entire Lightroom catalog and filter based on 3 or 4 stars, for example, to see just my very, very best photos. The point is that that type of filtering typically is going to give me everything I need for locating my photos. Of course, there's more. I talked about pressing / to bring up the library filter, where I can use attributes, so star ratings, color labels. I can also choose whether or not I'm viewing video files versus my virtual copies versus the master photos. I can go into metadata and select the date and which camera was used and which lens was used, and a variety of other attributes that I can select from. And I can even search by text, so I can search all of the searchable fields or just the keywords or whatever the case might be. And generally, I can find the photos I need simply by going to the right folder and filtering based on stars, but then I have all sorts of other metadata available to me that will hopefully make it easy for me to track down the specific photo that I'm looking for at any given time. So that gives you a sense of the overall workflow that I'm using. That key change really being assigning a red color label during the import process so that I know which photos I have reviewed and which photos still need to be reviewed. Let's see, looks like we have a couple of questions here. Good question. So Kevin asks how I deal with previews in Lightroom. So he's creating a catalog for each trip and then moves it to the external hard drive once he gets back, but the previews stay in the pictures on the Mac. So the previews, what I actually do when I'm traveling is I bring my master catalog with me. So the previews that you build inside of Lightroom, those do go with your Lightroom catalog. And so if you're using a traveling catalog on the go, you don't have access to any of your previews that are left back at home if you've got a computer at home. And so what I do, for me personally, a laptop has actually become my exclusive computer, the only computer I use. So my master catalog with all of my photos is on my laptop. So when I'm traveling, I always have access to my previews. I can always look at my photos and update metadata. I might not actually have the source photos if I didn't bring my external hard drives with me, but I'll at least be able to review those photos, and then I can import photos into that master catalog along the way. You could still use different catalogs, one for the photos that you're capturing while traveling and your other master catalog, but I do think that it might be worthwhile for many photographers to have their catalog with them, even if that means that they bring their external hard drive with them and they put their Lightroom catalog on the external hard drive if, for example, they're working with a desktop setup at home. Jeff asks how I'm getting GPS coordinates on each of your photos. That is indeed provided by the camera. So I actually, when it came time to get a new camera, made my choice in large part based on which camera had a built-in GPS receiver. To me, it is invaluable. Now, admittedly, that's in large part because I travel rather extensively, and so for me, the location information where I captured photos is a really important piece of information. So I would sacrifice a little bit of resolution or, autofocus features or what have you in order to have GPS for every photo. There are some accessories, and so, for example, for many cameras, you can get an accessory GPS receiver that plugs into the camera. You could also use a smartphone with an app to record a track log that you could then synchronize to your photos in Lightroom after the fact, so that you're taking your track log location information and the time that the photos were captured and essentially blending that information so that the photos themselves will have those GPS coordinates. So great question. Actually, a good point to bring up. So let's get back to some of my photos with a red color label. And if we have multiple images that have color labels assigned to them, then how do we actually go about removing that color label? If you don't remember the keyboard shortcut, well, one of the key things to keep in mind is that just about anything you need for a particular task can probably be found on the right-click menu. So if we right-click on photos that have color labels assigned to them, for example, then we can go to our Set Color Label option here in this case and choose None. So I can select those, in this case, multiple photos, and right-click if I've forgotten the keyboard shortcut. You can also have the color label option available on the toolbar down below. All right. Oh, so there's a great question from Niels. What folder do you use for various random photos that you do not take during a specific event? And so for me, the example of that would be my smartphone captures that I might capture randomly all over the place. And for those, I actually create kind of this secondary folder structure for, in my case, iPhone captures. And those I will, if it's just a photo that doesn't relate to a specific trip, it's just kind of, you might say almost a generic photo, then I would tend to put it into that type of a folder structure. So it could just be, snapshots or personal captures or whatever makes sense for you. You might even use a date-based folder structure for those types of photos. It's not something I would typically use for my normal workflow, but it might be worthwhile in that type of situation. But do keep in mind, by the way, that we're always able to filter within our Lightroom catalog based on the date of capture, and so I don't consider that folder structure to be all that helpful, and it tends to kind of get in the way. Catherine asks how I organize keywords. Do I label species of animals, plants, and how precise are my location keywords? This, it's kind of tricky because I'm not going to define, for me personally, my own vocabulary for keywords, but I just want to have that core information. And one of the things to keep in mind is that as you add keywords, they will be added to the keyword list. And so if you are wanting to be consistent, you may want to turn on a checkbox for a particular keyword on the keyword list instead of typing it in, just to make sure that you're being consistent. So reviewing that keyword list from time to time, but mostly it's a matter of what's important to you and how do you think about it. And so for me, it tends to be, country and then specific subject matter. And I try to think about, am I really going to be searching for a waterfall, for example, versus, a castle or a church or a mountain range? I try to be thoughtful about what information I'm actually going to want to search for. And typically I find that when I'm looking for something in particular, I usually know which folder or which set of folders might give me that the ability to find that image. So I know that I photographed mountains in Austria and in Alaska, etc. And so I can usually work my way toward that. It's a tricky thing, and I don't have a perfect solution, because I guess the perfect solution would be that I have somebody full-time just constantly adding keywords to my images, or that the search technology, the image analysis, would improve more quickly, where I can perform these essentially automatic searches, as you might have seen from the cloud version of Lightroom CC. I hope that technology will become available in Lightroom Classic as well. But keywords are a tricky one, because we don't want to spend too much time adding keywords, but at the same time, then we wish we had all those keywords available to actually locate photos. And then let's see, do you back up the previews? So good question. Dan asks if I back up the preview files for the catalog or just the catalog. The Lightroom, as Dan notes, the backup for the Lightroom catalog only backs up the catalog and not the previews. And I do not personally make an additional backup intentionally. Now, as it turns out, I'm using a local backup. I'm on a Macintosh, and so I use Time Machine to back up my entire computer. So by virtue of my catalog being on the internal hard drive, that's getting backed up by Time Machine, and so the previews are as well. But it's not something I worry about much, because those previews can be regenerated later. If you lost your catalog, obviously that's going to be a challenge and a frustration, but if you're able to restore from a backup, you can select all of your photos once you've recovered that catalog, and you can rebuild all of the previews for every single photo. It can take a while. I had to rebuild previews when I had somewhere around 250,000 photos in my catalog, and it took all weekend long, full time, to regenerate the previews for all of those images. So it can be time consuming, but I don't feel that it's really critical, because it's just a cache, because you're not saving any information that would otherwise be lost. I don't consider it to be critical to actually create an additional backup of the previews above and beyond the catalog. And of course, most importantly, as of all, is backing up the photos themselves. And I should hasten to point out, by the way, which I did not mention, but in the catalog settings dialog, on the Lightroom menu on the Macintosh version, or on the edit menu on the Windows version, it's not something I set up for this demo catalog, but in the catalog settings dialog on the metadata tab, I recommend turning on the automatically write changes into XMP checkbox, so that all of your standard metadata, your star ratings, your color labels, your keywords, will all be written out to the actual photos themselves, or in the case of proprietary raw captures, an XMP sidecar file, to help preserve that information. So George asks if the auto-develop adjustments only apply to RAW. No, they actually will apply to all of your images that you import. Sometimes it works great, sometimes not so great, but it is different for a RAW capture, so you'll still have that auto available later if it was a RAW capture, as I mentioned. So how do you enter the develop preset into auto import? So the develop settings, there's two pieces to the auto adjustment during import. So if I go back into the develop module and go to create a new preset, then you'll see that I have the auto settings checkbox that I can include as part of a preset when I save a develop preset. And then, in this case, I already have a preset that I had created. And so if I go back to the import dialog, then you'll see that I have collapses, then I have my metadata preset and my develop preset, so that import preset is what includes those auto settings. Great question from Natalie. And actually, the last question we have time for today, but when I delete a photo from inside of Lightroom, does it get deleted from the backup location? And no, it does not. So if you're making use of this make a second copy during import option when you're importing your photos, which I highly recommend. That's creating a copy of those photos, all of your photos, in a separate location. That's a one-time task. And so if you perform that, you'll get that backup at a second location. But now when you've imported the photos into Lightroom and you're performing that review, if you delete photos, if you remove photos from your Lightroom catalog and choose to delete the source image from the disk, they will not be deleted from this second copy, from that backup you created. That stands alone and is separate on its own. And in fact, I tend to do a time machine backup shortly after import so that I've got yet another backup of that backup, just being a little bit paranoid. All right. Well, we went a little bit over time, but that is essentially all the time that we have for today. I will try to get to any of these additional questions that I might have missed. So if you submitted a question, then I'll try to follow up and get to you via email or address that in an upcoming Ask Tim Gray email newsletter. And if you've got additional questions, feel free to send me via email as well. I'll try to get to as many of those as possible. In the meantime, on account of having updated my workflow a bit, I'm actually going to be updating some of the content that's included in my Mastering Lightroom Classic CC bundle of video courses on the GreyLearning website. And so if you're interested, if you don't already have access to that full bundle, now if you have the GreyLearning Ultimate bundle, that means that you have access to all content in the GreyLearning library, including new content as it is added. But if you don't have that subscription and you don't yet have the full Lightroom Classic bundle, you can get $20 off just by using coupon code WORKFLOW through the GreyLearning website. Or if you want to get started with the discount already included, just point your web browser to timgray.me/workflow, and that will have the discount automatically included. And in the next few weeks, when we get that course updated to reflect my brand new workflow, you'll have immediate access to that as soon as it is published. So I want to thank all of you once again for joining me today, and a thanks to Tamron also for making the GreyLearning Webinar Series possible. I appreciate all of you showing up. I appreciate Tamron supporting us, and I will look forward to seeing you at the next presentation as part of the GreyLearning Webinar Series in just a couple of weeks. Thanks very much, and we'll talk to you soon.